Chapter 8 Anecdotes of Lieutenant C. Journey up Frack Hill. Napoleon upon elementary chemistry. Captain Wallace, the Emperor's New Year's gift. Napoleon's solicitude about Captain Meynell's health. Napoleon was very anxious about hearing any gossip relative to picnics, balls, or parties that took place at St. Helena, and always made me recount to him what we did, who we met, and who were my partners. He once asked me who danced the best at the governor's balls, and on my replying, Mrs. Wilkes, the governor's lady, he was anxious to know what sort of dances were the fashion there. I described their quadrilles and country dances, which had been introduced by Mr. C., the greatest beau that ever came to St. Helena. This youth was and exquisite that he would sit with his feet elevated considerably above his head for an hour before dressing for dinner, that he might squeeze them the more readily into tight shoes. He wore his epaulette nearly down to his elbow, and his sword belt was embroidered with golden oak leaves. The same kind of embroidery confined his silk stockings round each knee, where it resembled the order of the garter. His disgust was very great at finding the St. Helena ladies understand nothing but kitchen dances and reels, and he immediately began to drill, and after much toil succeeded in instructing them in the mysteries of the quadrille figures. Once whilst he was figuring away in the capacity of dancing master, my mother very unceremoniously put her foot on his heel, because he stood bending before her and nearly extinguishing her eye with the swallow tails of his uniform coat. The perplexity this occasioned him was considerable, from the difficulty he had in thrusting his foot again into its tiny case. Napoleon was so amused with our description of young C. that he begged us to bring him to Longwood if he could get a pass. One was accordingly procured, and as the Emperor's eye rested on him, putting on a most comical look, he told him that he had heard from Miss Betsy that he was a great dandy, which was anything but pleasing intelligence to the young hero, who began to think he was indebted for the honor of this interview with the great man to the circumstances of his being considered a sort of tomfool. Napoleon, suiting his conversation, which, as I have before said, he always did, to his company, began admiring the cut of his coat and said, "You are more fortunate than myself, for I am obliged to wear my coat turned." This had really been the case, as no cloth could be procured on the island of the shade of green worn by Napoleon and his suite. Young C's interview with the great man, however, ended very satisfactorily to both, for although a little too conceited, he was very gentlemanly, spoke French fluently, and left a pleasing impression on the exile of Longwood. One morning, my father told me he was going to Longwood and had been requested by the Emperor to bring myself and sister to see him, as he had something curious to show us. We were only too happy to obey his wishes, and the next day saw us at Longwood. He reproached us for having so long neglected to pay him a visit, and wished to know why we had absented ourselves so much from him. On my telling him I had but just recovered from a slight attack of coup de soleil, he was quite cheering in his sympathy. I told him it had been occasioned by my walking with Captain Mackey and my sister to call on Mrs. Wilkes, and that our way led over to the high mountain at the back of the Briars, called Peak Hill. It was certainly a tremendous undertaking for one so young to attempt. The mountain is not accessible to four-footed animals, and is 2,000 feet in height and nearly perpendicular. Imagine, therefore, our toiling to its summit and descending to the deep valley beneath, crossing Francis Plain and ascending two mountain ridges before terminating our expedition. We arrived at Plantation House worn and weary, but when once there, the kindness of the lady governess and the care and attention of her amiable and lovely daughter soon made us forget our fatigues, and at noon of that same day we started for Sir William D's lovely valley of Fairyland. I described all our adventures and the kindness we had received from Mrs. Wilkes at Plantation House and from Miss D at Fairyland. A few days after, Napoleon invited the former lady with her husband and daughter to Longwood, but for political reasons, the honor of the interview was declined. The wonderful exhibition we were invited to see was the process of turning water into ice by one of Leslie's machines sent out to Napoleon for that purpose. He explained the process to us and tried to enlighten me as to the principle upon which air pumps were formed. He advised me, moreover, to get a book upon elementary chemistry for my amusement and improvement, and finished as usual by turning to my father, recommending him to enforce a lesson every day, and directing the good Mr. O'Meara, as he called his doctor, to be my examiner. After making a cup of ice, he insisted upon my putting a large piece into my mouth and laughed to see the contortions it induced from the excessive cold. It was the first ice that had ever been seen at St. Helena, and a young lady, Mr. F., who was with us, would not believe that the solid mass in her hand was really frozen water until it melted and streamed down her fingers. I recollect ending the morning's diversions by cutting from Napoleon's coat an embroidered bugle and running away with it as a trophy. I now regret that I did not keep it, but like most of the other relics and valuable mementos, I gave it away. It was attached to the coat he wore at Waterloo.